Good day. Welcome to our first video about basic math. In this video, we're going to talk about rounding. Just should be a refresher from school. So what's rounding? Well, we round numbers to provide an ease of writing numbers. We've all punched numbers into a calculator, had 18 decimal places, right? Well, we're not going to write down all 18 decimal places. So we're going to round to 2 decimal places, 3 decimal places, 4, depending on the task that we're doing. If we're talking about money, we're going to go to 2 decimal places. The problem with rounding is it reduces accuracy. If anyone remembers the old pi, right, 3.1415, and it goes on for infinity, right? The more we round numbers, the less accurate they'll be. If you think about money, right, if I had $10.95, I could round that up to $11, but I don't have $11, right? I only have $10.95, so we lose accuracy on that. Too much rounding or rounding repeatedly at each step in a process can greatly impact the final result of a recipe or a costing exercise. If you think about a recipe that has 15 ingredients in it, and we round off each one of those ingredients so that, like my example, we're missing 5 cents for every ingredient. By the time we reach the end of the recipe, we're out 75 cents, right? Which can make a big difference on the cost of your dish and how you set your selling price. And especially if you sell 1 million of these. If you're a fried chicken place and you sell fried chicken and you're losing 5 cents for every chicken you sell, that's a lot of money over the course of a year, right? So we have to be careful of when we round and is it warranted and how we round. I mean, we start looking at things that are things that we can't divide. For instance, if we were trying to figure out how many cooks we needed in the kitchen when we had 150 people coming in for dinner that night, and we used our math and we got, 4.3 cooks. Well, we can't bring in 0.3 of a cook. And if we go to 4, we probably aren't going to have enough, so we're going to have to round to 5, even though it doesn't follow your normal rounding rules, which we're going to talk about here in a bit. So here's a number, 4.87315, right? If you remember, we had places for these numbers. So there's the 10th place, the 100th place, the 1000th place, etc., right? How do we round? Well, that depends on the number next to where we want to go. So we identify the place in which we want to round. So do we want to round to the tens or the hundreds? If we're talking money, we're rounding to the hundredths, right? If the number next to that is below 5, we're going to drop. If it's over 5, we're going to go above, right? So I think I've got an example coming up here shortly, right? So when rounding up, if the target is 9, you have to carry the 1 as it is an addition. So we would move the whole next up to the next tens or the next hundredths, right? So for example, this one, 71.892 to the nearest hundredth. So the hundredth is where the 9 is, right? So if we're going to round to the nearest hundredths, are we going to move that 9 up, or is it going to stay the same? Well, we look to the number that's next to it. And the number that's next to the 9 here is the 2. So 2 is less than 5. So when we round this, we're going to be left with 71.89. Right? So next example, we're still rounding to the hundredths, but now this number next to the 9 is a 7, which is more than 5. So how do we move this one? Because if we move 9 goes to 10, right? So then we have to follow it into the tens position. So we're going to end up with 71.90. And we want to make sure we leave that 0 on so that we understand that we did round up from the hundredths, right? Because we wanted a hundredth place, so we want to make sure we have 2 decimal places. Think about money, right? We're not going to say that that was $71.09, right? We're going to leave that 0 on and it's easier to understand. We recognize that that's 90 cents more easily. So when to round and by how much? Well, it depends on how many calculations you're doing. Like I said in the recipe, if you had 15 different ingredients, we're going to save rounding until the very end of our calculation. Because if we round too early, that error, or not error, but that inaccuracy is going to cascade through our whole calculation, and it's going to amplify, right? The more times we do a calculation with another rounded number, and then we round that number, then we round that number, and then pretty soon we have an answer that's nowhere near what we want it to be because we've rounded too much, right? So rounding also depends on what measurement tools we have available, right? So if you're using a digital scale and you're measuring grams, you can probably go to 1 gram. But if you're using a micro scale, it might go to 0.00, like to 2 decimal places, right? So depending on how you can measure it is going to depend on how you round, right? So how accurate can you be? If you're measuring with measuring cups, you can only round to like 1/4 cup, right? So how accurately can each of these tools measure? Well, like I said, the digital scale, it really depends on the scale. Most of them, if we're talking grams, they'll go to 1 gram, or maybe the 10th, so 1/10 of a gram, right? But if you get those little micro scales that I use in charcuterie for measuring out nitrate and nitrate, we've got scales that'll go to the 100th place of a gram. Beam scale, right? Remember those from baking, where you put a weight on one side and you'd put your ingredient on the other side and you had to look for it to balance? Not so accurate, because maybe they're balanced, but they're still off kilter a bit, right? So it's not a super accurate measuring tool. Volume measures, and really these are volume measures like measuring cups, Cambros with, the measurements on the side. How accurate are they? Not as accurate as a digital scale, right? And of course, money's only relevant to the nearest penny, right? So if we have an adjusted recipe that calls for 16.34 ounces of flour measured on a digital scale, when we want to round appropriately, well, it depends on how accurate the scale is, right? If the scale can only measure to 1/10 of an ounce, our 10th is where the 3 is, right? So is it going to be 16.3 or is it going to be 16.4? Well, that depends on the number next to the 3. Well, in this case, it's a 4, which is less than 5, so we're going to end up with 16.3 ounces, right? Next example, we're talking money, right? Rounded appropriately, how many decimal places do we deal with money? Even though I know pennies are disappearing, we still use them to calculate our profits, right? Because every penny counts in our business. Just because we can't go to the bank and get pennies anymore doesn't mean we don't use them. So money is always rounded to 2 decimal places. And in this case, it's where we've got the 6, right? So what number is next to the 6 is a 9. So that means that 6 has to go up. It's not going to stay the same, right? So we're going to end up with $23.47.